Welcome to Mysteries of Superstition Mountain. I'm Larry Hedrick, where we bring the past into the present for our future viewers. Today we have another great story by Hank Sheffer.
Today I want to talk to you about one of the greater enigmas to come out of our western Arizona history. Now it's kind of interesting. We know quite a lot about this fellow, only because of the people that he apparently ran a parallel life with. He was with them, and because of them, we know more about him. And one of those people, of course, is Sieber. He was a very, very instrumental in how the Apache Kid's life turned out. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself with those people. Some folks believe that the Apache Kid was born in the Aravaipa Canyon, just south, about 25 miles southwest of San Carlos. His given name, you have to bear with me here, was Haskay-bay-nay-ntayl. That's right, I didn't make that up, that was his name. Haskay-bay-nay-ntayl, which means the tall man destined to come to a mysterious end. Of course it does. Well, according to my sources, Sieber was the one who came up with that, calling him the Apache Kid, because he figured it was a whole lot easier to say that than it was to say the Haskay-bay-nay-ntayl. Other sources say that he was born to an Apache family who later moved down into the Globe area, and he was there for a while. The bottom line is, no matter which one of the stories you hear about where he was from, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on too, was the fact that he was abducted by the Yumas, and he remained with them until the 1870s when the Army rescued him, and he met Sieber at that time. And Sieber literally adopted the Apache Kid. Well, now the history books tell us that Sieber actually didn't join the Cavalry. Everybody says Army, but he joined the Cavalry after the Civil War was over, and that was in 1871. And he worked as a scout for General George Stoneman, and we've heard that name in our history any number of times. By November of 1872, he was employed as a scout at Camp Walpi. And sometimes you'll see that as W-U-A-L-P-A-I, or you'll see it as H-U-A-L-P-A-I. And it was essentially a tent camp. It wasn't much more than that. Then in 1873, Sieber moved down into Fort Verity, and he was in charge of a large body of Apache scouts. And of course, the Kid was with him at that time, and he was forever learning more and more about the scouting business. We find that Sieber during this time was a very busy man, because the Apaches were very busy people. They had this propensity, you see, for killing people and marauding and robbing anything they can steal. Anyway, that's what they were doing. So Sieber was busy. We also find that during the 1870s, the Apache Kid attended school, probably not of his choosing, but rather Sieber's. At any rate, he went to the school at San Carlos, and apparently he was a pretty clever kid. It's said that he could speak several different languages. And it is actually my belief that during the Indian campaigns in '73, he's now out of school and he's back with Sieber. This is where he started learning all of his scouting skills. Within a few years, we're up to 1881 now, the Kid actually was old enough to join the cavalry himself. And he did that, and he enlisted with the U.S. Cavalry as an Indian scout under a program that was designed by General George Crook. And this was to help further quell all of the hostile raids that were going on. According to the writings of Judge Dan R. Williamson, who later became the Arizona State Historian, The first sergeant post came open in 1882 under Sieber. Well, now, that I don't mean it was the first sergeant, I mean he was the first sergeant. And that meant that he needed somebody to fill that post because the other fellow had been killed earlier. Well, the first Indian that Al Sieber wanted to appoint retired, and he just left the cavalry altogether because at that point in time, they only had to enlist for 3 months if they wanted to. They didn't have to enlist for any more than that. And so his second choice was actually the Apache Kid, and that was in 1882. During the entire time that followed, while in pursuit of Geronimo, it was the Apache Kid served with Sieber as his first sergeant. However, it wasn't until September of 1886, 4 years later, when the warring medicine chief Geronimo and what was left of his meager band actually surrendered and were shipped off to Florida. Now I have an interesting little sidebar that took place that I want to tell you about, because we all like rifles and we all like guns. Well, most of us do. During this time, after the Civil War, the 1886 Winchester rifle, there was one that once belonged to a man who was instrumental in leading this contingency of soldiers to actually capture or get Geronimo when he surrendered, more correctly. It was just sold at auction, but the story that comes with that auction is kind of interesting to me. It turns out that a fellow by the name of George Albee worked for the Winchester Rifle Company after the Civil War. And while he was there, bear in mind it's 1886, so you've probably guessed which rifle we're going to talk about. They introduced this brand spanking new lever action rifle, and it was the 1886 Winchester lever action. The fellow's name was George Albee, and what he did was he managed to wangle his way in, and he got the #1 rifle. That's the one that everybody wants, the one that says #1 on it. And it was their newest design. He presented that rifle as a gift to his old Civil War buddy, who was a U.S. Army Captain, Henry Ware Lawton. Well, Lawton carried that rifle, and it was with him when Geronimo surrendered. Did I mention to you that that rifle sold for $1.265 million? That's the highest price that's ever been paid for an auction weapon in history. At any rate, that and $1 will get you a pot of coffee anywhere. So anyway, now you can tell that story and make money at the bar or whatever you want to, or don't tell the story and whatever. As I had mentioned earlier, the place of the Apache Kid's birth date has met with some question. However, the next part of this story is quite explicit, because once again we refer to Dan Williamson, the judge, because he shares firsthand information that he got from Al Sieber. Not only got from Al Sieber, but he was with Al Sieber on many of his adventures. And he writes about those in an Arizona historical review titled Al Sieber, the Famous Scout of the Southwest. And you can look that up. It's a wonderful chapter in a book. You'll enjoy it. After the Geronimo campaign, everything was working in the kid's behalf. He was doing things right. He was working for the government. Can he do that? Unfortunately, right after this time was when the wheels started to come off of the wagon for the Apache Kid. In 1887, very shortly after, we're talking about September and January, so it's just that short distance of time to 1887, a fellow by the name of Toga de Chus threw this horrendous dance party for the Indians. This man was supposed to be the kid's father. Now, we really don't know that for certain, but according to Williamson, that's a fact. So I tend to believe that to be true because he was there. And at this particular dance party, apparently there was an awful lot of tiswin, which is Apache whiskey, was consumed, and everybody was sufficiently intoxicated by the end of the day. Unfortunately, come the following morning, it was discovered that the old chief, Toga de Chus, had been murdered. Had something to do with a knife that was sticking out of the middle of his chest, but he did not fare well with that. Now, according to the Apache code, what was supposed to happen, if this guy truly was the Apache Kid's father, he was supposed to go out and avenge his father's death and kill the guy who killed him. In this particular case, the fellow's name was Rip. Well, the kid didn't go. He was still at the reservation. But Sieber and Captain Pierce, who was he was actually the agent for the San Carlos reservation, had to leave the reservation for some errand that they had to run. So they left, but they told the kid, you just leave Rip alone, don't do anything. Well, of course, as soon as they left, guess where the kid went? He went. No sooner were they gone than the kid took 5 of his men to the camp of Rip and shot him. Killed him dead on a doornail. Some sources say that Rip resisted the arrest, which got him shot. Either way, old Rip came up short, and the kid was blamed for it nevertheless anyway. So it really didn't make any difference. When Sieber returned to the agency, he found that the kid was not there, or the other 5 guys that had been with him. They had gone off someplace else. They had gone back to where they would normally have stayed with their family or whatever it was, but they didn't go back to the reservation. So Sieber put the word out. He said, get your butt back here. And believe it or not, the kid did. And by June 25 of 1887, the kid and his warriors were back. Now, Sieber lined them all up in front of his tent. And he told the kid to take the guns and the cartridge belts away from all of the other guys. And when he was finished doing that, he then told the kid to put his gun and his gun belt on the ground. Now this next part of the story actually varies a bit, but it said that when Sieber had told these guys that they were going to go down to the guardhouse, there was a little consternation there, and they were resisting. And because of that, Sieber, he took the opportunity to reach inside of his tent and grab a rifle, at which time he shot one of them. Another version says that he went to retrieve his rifle, but never had a chance because there was a .45-70 rifle ball that hit him in his left ankle. And the other ones just took off. They just disappeared as quick as they could. Now, it's kind of interesting to me because one of the sidebars on Al Sieber is that through the Civil War and whatever else he did with the Indians, he was wounded 28 times with bullets, arrows, knives, whatever. One of the wounds that he had received was received during the Civil War that hit him in his lower left leg, traveled up his leg, and came out around his knee. Now, bearing in mind that had to be a slug that was somewhere around 58 caliber to 69 caliber bullet, and it just tore his leg up, something awful. Well, now we have another shot, and he gets shot in the same leg with a .45-70. And you think you had a bad day. Either way, here's what happened next. The small band of Apaches snatched up some horses, and they fled for the wilderness. The Army cavalry reacted, post-haste. They were after them in a heartbeat, and they were chasing them up the banks of the San Carlos River. Telegrams were sent from San Carlos to San Francisco. This was the headquarters division of the Pacific Railroad. And if you start looking at your railroad history, you'll see why that's important, because in this whole San Carlos area, the railroad was becoming more and more important. Territorial newspapers in Arizona and New Mexico picked up on the story of these Indians that had gotten away. And for 2 weeks, the marauding Apaches led the cavalry on a merry chase. The Kid and his band finally located high in the Rincon Mountains, which is down toward Tucson. The troopers surprised them, and they captured all their horses and all of their supplies, but the Indians kind of got away. They just disappeared, and now they're hiding. Unfortunately, what they're finding out is they don't have any supplies. They don't have anything going for them, and yet the cavalry is not giving up at all. They're going to get them, and it's not going to fare well for them at all. Finally, the kid got a message off to General Mills. Mills called off the pursuit if they would surrender, which they did on June 22nd. The Kid and the others surrendered by the 25th. Miles decided to try the Kid and 4 others in general court-martial. Despite the fact that they did not, in all probability, understand anything about the charges that were put up against them. After the trial was concluded, it was nobody's surprise that they were all found guilty of mutiny, and desertion. And they were all sentenced to death by firing squad. A bit harsh. According to General Mills, who was not very happy with the verdict at all, he ordered the court to reconsider the sentencing. And on August the 3rd, the court convened and reduced the sentences to life in prison. Miles still wasn't very satisfied with that either, and he reduced the sentence down to 10 years. The sentence began with the men in the San Carlos guardhouse until such time as the Army could decide what it was they needed to do with them. Now this is when things really start to get interesting. According to the court minute entry of January 23rd of 1888, time is not fleeting by here. It's only been a year or so, and the prisoners were originally slated to go to Fort Leavenworth, which is a military prison. That was changed to Alcatraz purely for the sake of appearances, because it wasn't a military prison. Now, on top of that, what happened next was unprecedented, but it worked out really well for the government. The Judge Advocate General's office reviewed the case and was convinced that the Indians had not received a fair trial. On October 13, 1888, Secretary of War William Endicott authorized the remission. That is to say, he let them all go for the remainder of the sentences of the 5 prisoners. And by November, they were all back on the San Carlos. Now, on top of all that consternation, pressure was also brought to bear by the Indian Rights Association. I don't think they had signs out or were marching in the streets. I don't think they did that. But they were unhappy about the federal misuse of the territorial jurisdictions with the Army. The court not only agreed to the release of those named in the original suit, but they also released all of the Apaches that were held as federal prisoners in Illinois and Ohio. Now, why that had anything to do with Arizona or New Mexico, I had no idea, but that's what they did. But that meant that what they did was released at least 11 murderers, people who had been marauders and renegaders. They were all out there killing people and robbing and carrying on, and they were being released back to San Carlos. Of course, this made all the Indians really happy, but the people of the Southwest were just totally outraged. All of these Indians, who we know are pretty proficient at killing people, maiming people, torturing people, are now back on the streets, as we would say today. Okay, now, so here we go again. It's the middle of October of 1889, and things were getting all turned around again. Sheriff Glenn Reynolds of Gila County was issued some arrest warrants. He was supposed to go out and rearrest the freed Apaches, which of course included the Apache Kid. They were all apprehended very shortly thereafter. The trial of the Kid and 4 others was set for October 25th. So these guys didn't mess around. They got things done in a hurry. The sheriff did. 5 days later, they were found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. On November 1, the Indians and 1 Mexican prisoner were slated to travel through the Pinal Mountains by a special stage to make their way to the territorial prison in Yuma. I have to interject here that I really don't believe that Sheriff Glenn Reynolds or his deputy, William Holmes, whose nickname was Honky Dory of all things, and the stage driver, Eugene Middleton, took these prisoners very seriously. They really should have, but I don't think they did. And I think perhaps part of it was because even though we're in Arizona, we're in central Arizona, but it's getting into November. It's November 1, and it's snowing, and it's cold, and the temperature is below freezing. It's miserable. Well, by not taking these guys seriously, it proves once and for all that complacency can get you killed. The 2-day trip started in Globe, and it was destined for Casa Grande. The remainder of the trip was then to be completed by rail over to Yuma. The journey started out okay, but by the second day, the whole plan started going south, as we say. On the Gila River near a little town of Kelvin, which later became known as Ray, also became known as Riverside, those kind of crossed over, was in Pinal County. The driver pulled the team up, and he said, we're in loose sand here, and he says, we're going up this grade, known as the Kelvin grade, and he found it necessary to unload at least 7 of those prisoners. They were shackled hand to hand to each other. The Kid and another one of the worst of the bunch was a fellow by the name of Haskay. I'm not making this up. That was his name, Haskay. And these guys were handcuffed. Their wrists were handcuffed and their ankles were handcuffed. So they stayed in the stagecoach. The driver, according to one story, says that they would drive the stagecoach up to the top of the hill, the top of the grade, Kelvin grade, after the others got up there. He was going to let the horses rest. The other story says that he drove ahead of them and he was waiting for the other prisoners and the sheriff and deputy to come up and greet them. Either way, it doesn't matter because the outcome would have been the same. While the party started trudging up the hill with Deputy Reynolds at the front and Deputy Holmes in the back, 2 of the Indians suddenly grabbed at Reynolds. They grabbed his pistol. They got a hold of that, and they got a hold of Holmes, and they knocked him over backwards. Didn't kill him, but his heart attack did. Had a heart attack, for Pete's sake. So they got him. And a fellow by the name of Pushlete, a very unnice Indian, proceeded to shoot the sheriff in the neck and then shot the helpless Holmes through and through, and he was already dead. In the meantime, Middleton, whether it was at the top of the hill or at the bottom of the hill, doesn't matter, he was guarding the other 2 prisoners. It was cold and it was starting to snow again, and the Kid told him, I will sit down and I will just sit here, don't shoot. The scene up the hill was not visible from the stage in either case, whether it was up the hill or down the hill, as I mentioned. And Middleton, when he heard the shots going off, he thought that it was the sheriff that was doing the shooting. Well, in what must have seemed like a heartbeat, the Mexican prisoner, who was actually a horse thief, he had escaped, and he managed to get down the hill, and he come down there and he related to them what was going on up there. That was when all hell broke loose. Pushlete had run down the hill and all of a sudden jumped out from behind the coach. He fired at Middleton with the sheriff's rifle, and Middleton fell to the ground with a bullet through his cheek that came out his throat. Well, now Middleton was in bad shape, but he was still conscious laying there on the ground. He figured that he was a goner. He just knew that there wasn't anything he could do. He was a goner. But it was the kid who saved his life. The kid told Passepartout, he said, "Save your cartridges. He's dead anyway." Middleton later related that while they were stopped waiting for the others by the coach and sitting there, Middleton had given the kid a cigarette. And it may just very well have been that cigarette that saved Eugene's life, because the kid had some compassion there, whatever that was. But he didn't, nobody killed Middleton. Oh, yeah, I know. You're probably wondering what happened to the Mexican. Well, his name, near as we can tell, was Jesus Alvet. And he was a horse thief, and he'd been convicted of that. He managed to cut a horse loose, and off he went. He was headed best he could to get to Florence. After he got to Florence, he related all the stories to them, having stopped at Riverside first. He told them, so they knew up there, and now he's in Florence. And apparently, after going through all of this mess up here on the hill, the governor felt pretty bad for him and gave him a pardon. So Jesus was set free. Now that left only Middleton, still lying there playing possum, while the Indians unshackled themselves. They'd gotten the keys out of the sheriff's pockets and the deputy's pocket. And so they were unshackling themselves, and they were making sure everybody was dead that was supposed to be dead. And then they finally let out this humongous yelp, and off they went. When a cold, still quiet finally fell over the massacre scene, Middleton staggered to his feet to go and seek help. He found that Holmes' body had not been molested. He'd been shot, but he hadn't been molested. But now the sheriff was a different story. He had been terribly jabbed and cut up by the muzzle of a gun, and his forehead had been smashed with a rock, which was typical Apache. That was typical of what they would do with bodies, because if they couldn't recognize you in the great hunting ground, then you couldn't stay there. It was not until the following morning when Middleton managed to drag himself back to Riverside Station. It was a stage station. That was some 5 miles away. Don't forget, it's snowing like the dickens, and this guy's hurting. So for him to even make those 5 miles, to me, is amazing. A posse from Glove started on the trail of the fugitives, but soon had to return on the account of the snowstorm. So we're not just talking snow coming down, we're talking about something nasty happening here. The Indians had struck up the river to the mouth of the San Pedro, near the site of the town of Hayden, and then over to San Carlos. Now, for all of you out there who like to follow these things on maps, you can Google them just the way I'm saying them, and you can follow exactly what happened, where it happened, and how it happened. It's really kind of interesting to do that, but I can't do that while I'm talking to you. Finally, the head of Passepartout was cut off and carried to the agency headquarters. He did not fare well with that. They took him to Al Sieber, thus proving that he was truly dead. One of the Indians was badly wounded, and he wandered off. But he was later, this particular guy was later captured in Florence. Almost forgot that. He was captured. And he was the only one that completed the trip to Yuma prison, of all things. Now, the Apache Kid, on the other hand, did manage to make good his escape. This whole thing that took place on the Kelvin Highway, which is known now as the Florence-Kelvin Highway, was known as the Kelvin Massacre. For several years after that, he was a veritable nightmare to everybody in central and southeast Arizona. Everybody knew the name of the kid, and whether or not it was him who was the one that was causing all the problems, we're never going to know for sure. But everybody knew him. He was known from the Tonto Basin to the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. It's interesting that it really didn't matter what he did. He was blamed for it anyway because everybody knew him. They knew him all the way over to what now is known as the Apache Kid Wilderness in the Sieber National Forest over in New Mexico. Well, now this is where the enigma part comes in for the Apache Kid. We've had a hard time narrowing down where he was born. We really don't know for sure. We have some ideas where he was born, and any one could be true, any one of them at all, because they're all somewhere near the San Carlos Reservation. Now we get around to the other part of the enigma. We don't know what happened to him after he disappeared from the Kelvin massacre. For quite some time, people knew, as I say, they had known who the Apache Kid was, and there were sightings of him. They'd say, oh, I saw him. That kind of like I saw Elvis eating a peanut butter sandwich in the A&P store. Over the next several years, the kid was accused of any number of crimes, including rape and murder, but there was never any clear evidence that it was actually him. So we really can't narrow that down to him. But for all intents and purposes, with nothing being able to be confirmed, the Apache Kid just simply vanished. The last reported crimes allegedly committed by the kid were in 1894. That year, this one's important, that year in the San Mateo Mountains west of Socorro, New Mexico, Charles Anderson, a rancher, and his cowboys killed an Apache who had been resting their cattle. They maintained that this was the Apache Kid. While that identification was contested, it was never proven one way or the other if it was really the kid. After that, the kid became something of a legend in his own right. In 1896, John Slaughter claimed that he shot him over in the mountains of Chihuahua, but that wasn't true either. That didn't happen. In 1899, Colonel Emilio, here you go, Kosterlitsky of the Mexican Reales reported that the kid was alive and well and living among the Apache in the Sierra Madre Occidental. That was never confirmed. It was all hogwash for what we know. And for what I want to tell you, I'm not going to tell you it actually happened because I don't believe that he was there. Another source relates a story that the 17-year-old Billy Keene, a member of one of the many posses, actually had the head of Apache Kid in Chloride, New Mexico, as late as 1907. Well, that one just way too far out. Some of the demise stories go so far as to say that the cattle ranchers, well into the 1920s, were still blaming the Apache Kid. I think they were drinking some of that Tiswin Apache whiskey that the Indians had way back. Most of the people just really believed that he was dead of some sort of sickness or lead poisoning of some sort. And before we go, I have to tell you, there's another interesting little story about the Apache Kid that's not really well known, but I found it kind of curious. The Apache Kid, along with everything else, had a propensity for the women. And he had this deal where what he would do is he would go into a camp and he would abduct a woman and haul her off with him. He made sure he left the kids with the father, but he would take the wife, and he'd take the woman and off he'd go. He'd keep her for a while, and I don't know what that while amounted to. I don't know if he wore her out or just got tired of her, she got tired of him, or whatever the story was. But what would happen was he would take that woman back to where he got her and steal another one and haul her off. And he was known to have taken them as far as New Mexico. He'd taken them down into Mexico. But then when he was done with them, he took them back. So there has to be something said for that, I guess. Well, be that as it may. Today, about a mile from Apache Kid Peak, high up in the San Mateo Mountains of the Sieber National Forest, there's a marker at the gravesite that stands that commemorizes the Apache Kid. And this is from the time when Anderson supposedly killed the Apache Kid back in 1894. Now, according to the residents, what actually happened was he was killed all right, but they just left him lay. And between the buzzards getting him and people later on taking souvenirs of the Apache Kid, there's absolutely nothing left up there at all of him other than that gravesite. And this pretty much is why the year of 1894 is the most widely accepted date of his demise. Now, it may be unfortunate, but I believe that we may never know the real truth concerning what happened to the famous or infamous Apache Kid. I'm afraid he's just going to have to stay stranded out there someplace. And apparently, his name says it all, because it says he was the tall man destined to come to a mysterious end, right here on Mysteries of the Superstition Mountain. Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.